All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nick Foster. I'm the director of the Wilton Historical Society. I'm happy to welcome everyone to the fourth and final lecture in this year's series, A Rocky Road, The Struggle for Rights in America. On behalf of the Wilton Historical Society and Wilton Library, I'd like to thank Tom and Virginia Gunther for being our very generous sponsors for today's lecture. And I'd also like to thank Lauren Modi for being a sponsor of the overall series. So thank you to all of you. And to thank you to everyone who donated as part of your registration for the series. Your contributions are what make lectures like these possible. So thank you. I'd also like to once again thank the Lecture Planning Committee who organizes the annual series, which is now its 16th year. And we're looking forward to returning again next year as part of this wonderful annual event. So before I pass it off to Steve Hudspeth, who's going to be our moderator for today, I'd like to remind everyone that there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the lecture. And that we'll also be hosting a reception in the main lobby, so there'll be some wine, some cheese, some crackers, lovely stuff, in the main lobby afterwards. So please join us for that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Steve, who's going to introduce our lecture for today.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's a real pleasure to introduce you, and I'm so delighted that you're here, Kelly. This is Professor Kelly Marino. She teaches at Sacred Heart University. We've had a chance to talk with her about some of the work she does with her students, which involve not only survey courses, but also very serious research in Connecticut history involving Irish immigrants, for example, and homes that some of the orphans were housed in. So it's really amazing research that she's doing and involved in, and she has a book that will come out spring a year from now that deals with the women's rights movement in America in the 20th century, and with a special focus on higher education and the role of women in it. That's quite remarkable work. I can describe some more here, and I have a list of it that's really quite impressive. I'm going to read a little bit of it, but not too much of it, so we can not stand in the way of your coming up here. Professor Marino's research focuses on social and political movements, 20th century American history, and the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. A native of our state, she's interested especially in our state and local history, as well as women's history and the history of sexuality. She writes about minority struggles and activism on issues of age, education, gender, and sexual discrimination. And she has that book coming out, as I mentioned, a year from now, that will deal with those issues as they relate particularly to the women's movement in the 20th century. Kelly has many probing questions in her academic research, and her writing explores both the history and present reality of struggles of all types in America for equality. She advances the notion that I find was particularly interesting of the inclusion within the term suffragist of those who work to facilitate equality both at the ballot box and more generally. For women, yes, for sure, but also for blacks and other minority groups and for LGBTQ plus persons. And that is, in fact, the focus of her speech tonight. She's speaking about the long road towards LGBTQ plus rights and equality. And I love your notion that the suffragist movement should be viewed in a very broad context. I look forward to your helping us think about teaching and researching outside the box as well as within it. So thank you very much for being here.
For coming out. I know it's a beautiful day today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this topic that I'm really passionate about, which is the sexual revolution, the history of the gay rights movement, the modern gay rights movement in the US, and also a focus especially on activism for AIDS, which was a huge cause taken up in the late 20th century by a lot of LGBTQ rights activists. This is a very fun topic. One of the reasons that I wanted to discuss it today is because one of the huge figures that was involved in it, Larry Kramer, was actually from Bridgeport, which is quite remarkable. He died just recently in 2020, and a huge figure that being lost to this community when he passed away. And I wanted to start by reading a little bit about his biography. This is from an article that was written after he died. Just so we have a sort of a starting point. So in the early 1980s, a little understood disease called AIDS was stigmatized as society turned its head away from the hundreds of gay men it was killing. But then Larry Kramer published his essay, 1,112 and Counting. If this article doesn't rouse you to anger, fury, rage, and action, Gay men have no future on this earth, Kramer wrote. Unless we fight for our lives, we shall die. And so this is a quote from his article that was very famous. Kramer, an Oscar-nominated screenwriter for the 1969 film Women in Love, further brought the AIDS epidemic to the public eye with his semi-autobiographical play, The Normal Heart, which focused on the rise of the AIDS crisis in New York and was later adopted into an HBO film in 2014. He was one of the first activists in the fight against AIDS, and in 1982, he co-founded the Gay Men's Health Crisis, a leading provider of AIDS, HIV prevention care and advocacy. Kramer was ousted from the group a year later after his rhetoric caused a rift within the group, but in 1987 he helped to found ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, a more extreme organization that performed demonstrations, die-ins, political funerals, and speeches against government officials, religious leaders, and Wall Street to speed up AIDS research and advocate for the LGBT community. So in a way, the presentation today sort of honors his work, his legacy, and provides a context for it. Since he is such a well-known figure that was from a Jewish family, from Bridgeport originally, and then became pretty well-known in New York City and then nationally over time. So just to give us a little background information about the time period that we're learning about, we're talking about today, we're focusing on, to start off with, the 60s and the 70s, and the culture in that time period. This time period historically was known as the era of the Second Sexual Revolution. In US history, as you guys probably know from college when you were younger, the first sexual revolution took place in the 1920s, according to scholars, due to the invention of things such as the automobile, which brought dating from the private and the home into the public and gave people a new venue to kind of go out and take their partner or spouse on a date. It really changed sexual liaisons and dating culture. Second sexual revolution, again, 1960s and 70s, according to scholars. It's characterized by a lot of experimentation and innovation and relationships and identity. It's fueled by young people, especially college students are fueling the sexual revolution. And just to give you an idea statistically of how important some of these buzzwords and topics were to this generation, and this is from my own research, according to the Barnard Bulletin, which is the college newspaper from Barnard College, the term sex came up in the newspaper via search 300 times from 1970 to 1979. The Columbia State newspaper had 789 hits for that term. So that shows you how much people were focused on some of these topics. The scene among young people, it was very much seeking pleasure. It was a pleasure-prone lifestyle. I want to do what makes me feel good was the culture of that moment, especially by the 1970s. I'm not really thinking a lot about consequences of some of the behavior, and studies statistically on sexual behavior from the 70s showed that overall there was an increase in premarital sex, sexual partners, the age of a first experience, decrease in abstinence, and an increase in bisexuality. So those are some statistics from this time period. Also popular during the time period were buzzwords that were coined by the hippies, right? Like free love. The hippies talked about the power of sex, the beauty of love, the idea of hooking up, having relationships without any strings attached. And that concept actually became more popular than actually committed relationships or dating during the time period. Again, having sort of these non-committal, sort of just fun flings with different people. And this was an era of a whole list of different things. Open marriage, date swapping, communal sex, partners living together before marriage, bisexuality, homosexuality, androgyny, transsexuality is the old term that would be today changed to transgender, individuals, that identity becoming more visible, first sex change procedures performed at a lot of institutions during the later part of the 20th century. And this is very much a part of the mainstream, especially youth culture during the 1970s especially. This is all fueled, this change in culture, by a rampant drug and alcohol use among the younger generation, especially college students, largely unchecked in a way that today would be kind of curbed by a lot of the laws both on and off campus, not so much during the time period. And so this rampant alcohol and drug use leads to a looser, more sexually active generation of younger people with lower inhibitions. It decreases the likelihood of people using safe sex practices, right, if they're under the influence. And also, a lot of this is fueled by other cultural trends such as rock and roll music, Woodstock, outdoor music festivals being very popular during the time period, and an overall attitude that's just very much like we need to live in the moment due to the realities of the Vietnam War and the fact that you might not come back if you went overseas, so you might just live it up. If you go to Vietnam, who knows what's going to happen? A time period that there's still the Cold War going on, so people are concerned that we're going to be attacked have a nuclear attack, and what's going to happen then? We might as well enjoy our life, because that could be a reality. And so there's a lot of different things socially, culturally, politically going on in the 60s and 70s that are very much fueling the changes that historians note over time in this particular time period. And among U.S. servicemen, what's interesting is the most common drug that was used by American servicemen who were involved in the Vietnam War was actually marijuana. Statistically, I always tell the students that because they always find it interesting, like an interesting fact from this time period. But a lot of experimentation. This is also the time period of a very active feminist movement. So it's the second wave feminist movement in the late 20th century. And a lot of the second wave feminists are taking these personal issues and they're making them very political, right? They're talking about rape, sexual assault, reproductive rights, these things that would be taboo to discuss in the public sphere or even politically before, and they're bringing them out in the open, and discussions about them out in the open. And one of the things that they're really challenging, there's a lot of different things, but one of them is the rise of the pornography industry, Playboy magazine, things like that during the time period that are objectifying women. And so they're protesting a lot of the college students on campus by holding things like ban the bra days, nude-ins on campus to challenge the objectification of women's bodies by some of these different institutions like Playboy the magazine, which was very popular among college students in the 60s and 70s. Feminist leaders come on the scene and they become role models and icons for college students like Gloria Steinem, who's in the picture, which I'm sure you guys all know, you've probably seen her picture before. And she actually had an abortion at a young age, and she actually went undercover at a Playboy club, and she wrote about what she witnessed and how women were not being respected, right? And she became a prominent journalist, founded Ms. Magazine, huge icon and role model for women. And then of course other figures too, like Betty Friedan, who's going to have like a different sort of mentality or political style than Gloria Steinem, but she's going to write that book, The Feminine Mystique, and talk about the problem that has no name, which is women's dissatisfaction with being housewives. And that's going to galvanize a generation of women by the early 1960s to get involved in the women's movement and talk about some of the stuff that has been going on in their relationships and personal lives that they were very unsatisfied with. And so activists during the time period very much are talking about all the different topics that are on the slide: date rape, sexual violence, again, things like wearing a bra, reproductive rights, abortion access, birth control access during the time period. And what's interesting is that a lot of the feminists, especially early on, or the second wave women's activists might be a more appropriate term, were pretty hostile toward the LGBTQ+ agenda. People like Betty Friedan thought that it was a distraction from the mainstream women's movement and it would further radicalize their movement in the era of the Cold War, where it was already kind of radical to be protesting for women's rights. So they did not want to respect, like, for example, lesbian issues. It wasn't until 1972 when the National Organization for Women, which was one of the organizations that Betty Friedan helped to create, in 1972 they actually decided, okay, we're going to incorporate some issues that are prominent among the lesbian community, but it took that long for them to start to be more inclusive. A little bit about some of the other causes that feminists took up, or some of their other tactics. There were a lot of public protests and marches by the 60s and 70s, as I'm sure everybody here knows. The women's rights activists got involved with the Take Back the Night marches. And Take Back the Night, actually, we typically associate it with something that happens on college campuses today, but it actually goes way back. It originated as a women's rights protest in San Francisco. And the activists in 1978 were marching down a street in San Francisco where there were all kinds of strip clubs and sketchy sort of institutions, and they were protesting how these different institutions were basically promoting violence against women, objectifying female bodies, perpetuating disrespect. And so the first Take Back the Night march actually wasn't a college campus event, it was a mainstream event of the women's movement in San Francisco. And then college students think it's a pretty good idea, and so they take Back the Night to campus. And you start to see on college and university campuses these different marches under candlelight and speak-outs and protest sort of events to challenge things like date rape and sexual assault at a lot of colleges and institutions. And this is still something even at Sacred Heart that we have today. We usually have Take Back the Night. If you work on a college campus, you've probably seen it advertised before. But it was something very much embraced by the younger generation, especially of feminists, women's rights activists at colleges. As were other innovations during this time period, self-defense classes, workshops, martial arts training to teach women how to stay safe, especially on campuses which were increasingly becoming co-ed by the late 20th century, where they had been single-sex originally. And you start to see over time, different services in place institutionally to deal with sexual assault prevention and different things like that had not been things that were in place prior to this time period. In 1960, the birth control pill is legalized in the US, and it actually is something that really changes the lives of a lot of women because it gives them the opportunity to actually have a job and actually go to school and have greater control over their reproduction and how many children that they were actually having. So for some women, it's actually very beneficial in creating a lot of opportunities for them that maybe they didn't have prior. It also helps to divorce the idea among the public that sex was just for procreation and really promote the idea that it could be very much just for pleasure too. And this benefits the gay rights movement because it helps to normalize non-heterosexual encounters, sexual liaisons that are done for pleasure, and this idea of sexual experimentation for enjoyment. And that opens up a lot of possibilities for people in terms of their thinking. By the 1970s, STDs overall are on an increase because of oral contraception, and people are not using older, more popular barrier methods of birth control that they had used in prior generations. And it wasn't until the AIDS epidemic in the US that condoms were really widely used. And prior to this, if you look at European history, it was much more common, like for example, in Germany, for example, during World War I, condoms were distributed amongst soldiers to prevent soldiers from getting STDs when they were kind of off duty in different urban areas. But in the US, it took a while for that to be a normalized form of contraception. So you did have a lot of STDs going around by the 1970s, chlamydia, herpes, HPV, syphilis, gonorrhea, and then by the 80s, AIDS gets tacked on as another reality. Another thing that's very concerning that you could contract from having an encounter. The LGBTQ rights movement, globally, historically, internationally, right, if we're looking at the history of this movement, it takes off at the turn of the 20th century, the late 1800s, early 1900s, in places like Germany, due to the work of sexologists sexology is an offshoot of psychology. And sexology is the study of human sexual behavior, and it really emerges as a field within psychology at the turn of the 20th century. And what the sexologists try to show is that homosexuality is a natural phenomenon within the world. It's a natural variation of human sexual behavior. And a lot of the activists, the gay rights activists internationally in the Western world, over in Europe, they kind of use that rhetoric, that research coming out of the sexologist movement to say, hey, this is totally normal, and we should crack down on a lot of these anti-gay laws in a lot of, again, areas like England and Germany during the time period. And so there's a much longer history of gay rights activism if you look internationally. In the US, the first organized gay rights movement didn't really emerge until about the 1950s. It was very much inspired by the Civil Rights Campaign, the campaign for women's rights that was occurring during the time period. People within the gay rights movement were really inspired by people like Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King would say things, to try to encourage people very respectably to protest, right, using civil disobedience, nothing violent. He wasn't advocating violence, but to boycott, use these very respectable demonstrations, use the court system and test cases is what the NAACP was doing to gain greater ground for the civil rights movement. And a lot of the early gay rights activists are saying, this is a route that we want to also attempt during this particular moment. And so it's very much, according to sociologists, an assimilationist movement. We deserve respect because we're just like you. on the basis of our sameness and how we fit in. And I think Martin Luther King had a similar message. We are upstanding members of the community, and we are to serve respect. We're just like everybody else. And that is the rhetoric that a lot of the activists were using, gaining acceptance through fitting in, showing you're just like everybody else. And so when the Daughters of Bolitas, the lesbian organization, and the Mattachine Society, the gay organization, are protesting, they're doing it in very respectable ways. So the men are dressed in suits and ties, showing that they're upstanding members of the community. The women are wearing dresses and feminine clothing. And again, they're using the court system and court cases to try to create change. They're not burning anything down, right, or doing anything too controversial at this political moment in the 50s and even early 60s. And so these are a couple images. Daughters of Bolitas being a major national lesbian organization in the US, and Mattachine Society being primarily the dominant major gay rights organization as well. And they're also providing social spaces for LGBTQ people to come together, to socialize, to dance. And so these organizations are important for their social function as well as their political function. What really starts to change is by the late 60s and 70s, you start to see across the board within all social and political movements a radicalism that emerges, where you have a lot of young people who are sick and tired of waiting for change and want to push forward a lot of the social cultural changes and even political changes in a much more aggressive way than prior generations of activists. So a lot of the civil rights activists, so if you start to think about Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and Stokely Carmichael when he takes over SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then you start to look at the feminists, the liberation movement that comes out of the second wave feminist campaign, it becomes much more radical in the moment. And these gay rights activists are very much inspired by that radicalism. And so one of the things within the gay rights movement that really pushes things forward in a more public sense would be the Stonewall uprising in 1969 in late June, which is a series of protests against the police who were raiding the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay bar in Greenwich Village. And there's a lot of young, white, working class gay men who are there, as well as transgender activists. And they are very aggressive in their challenge to police authority on those series of evenings. And it gets a lot of media attention. And New York City, of course, is, they have the major New York Times. And this news gets spread very much across the country. It wasn't the first time that LGBTQ people had challenged authorities in a bar situation, but it's definitely the most publicized one, and I think the most aggressive challenge. Prior to this, homosexual acts were actually illegal in every state but Illinois. Bars and restaurants could be shut down for having gay employees or customers. You could be arrested for cross-dressing. And police raids were actually really common of gay bars. What's uncommon again in the moment is the level to which people fought back, the publicity it received, and the message that I think it sent, the way that it transformed the LGBTQ plus movement at that moment. So the homophile movement, as the activists in the 1950s and 60s dubbed their campaign, transitions into a gay liberation movement by the late 60s and into the 70s. So it moves from an assimilationist movement to a liberation movement inspired by Stonewall, inspired by African American civil rights activists. The civil rights activists are saying things like Black is beautiful, as you probably recall, the Black Panthers. And then the gay rights activists are taking the rhetoric and they're saying gay is good. So they're using that rhetoric. And again, the feminists are saying we're leading a liberation movement, and the gay rights activists are adopting that term, and they're saying we have a gay liberation movement going on by this time period. And the liberation movement is no longer about sameness, it's actually about embracing diversity and difference. So what they're now arguing is that because we're different, we should be valued. We have something important that we can offer American society and culture. You should be proud of your difference and embrace it. And so the message is very much like, be who you are, be proud of who you are in this moment. That idea of pride, having pride comes about, how Harvey Milk and some of these other, Carl Whitman from SDS, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was the anti-Vietnam War organization, comes out and writes a gay manifesto, and he tells people to come out, embrace who you are. And there's all these public marches and protests. It's about making a scene and really celebrating diversity in this moment. And it's like that across social and political movements, because we see it in the civil rights campaign and the women's movement as well, that change in rhetoric and political style. You start to see statistically that this cultural shift does in political shift have some actual real effects. So statistically, there is a decline in the age of which people start to come out, which by the 1970s is 22 for a man, 25 for a woman, and by the 90s it goes down even more into the teens in some cases, in the early 20s. But there is a backlash, right, to some of this activism, because the 1970s, as I'm sure you guys know, is also the rise of the new right. And so not everybody is really going to be happy with the shifts that are going on. And so liberalism is facing an aggressive backlash by the late 60s and into the 70s. And there are protests that are alarming people in cities nationwide. There are race riots during the time period, huge crime problems. The 1970s is known historically as the era of the serial killers, as I always tell the students because they love that fact. So there's huge crime problems that are very alarming. And so the politicians are saying we need to return to law and order and tradition. And that is, something that is also very much emerging during the time period. Republicans in the 1970s specifically have a particular political platform that's anti-welfare state, anti-environmentalist, and especially anti-gay rights. And a lot of gay rights or people that were opposing gay rights activists are saying that the LGBTQ community is destroying American families. One of the people that gets behind this is Anita Bryant, and she's a singer and beauty pageant winner. And she's known for her 1977 Save Our Children campaign to repeal the Dade County, Florida ordinance that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. She argued that because during the time period it was believed that homosexual people could not biologically reproduce, the only way that the community could grow would be by recruiting the children of heterosexual couples. And she linked in her campaign gay men with child molestation. This is a couple of quotes from her on the bottom. Homosexuals can't biologically reproduce, therefore they must recruit our children. And so this is a campaign that she led in Florida, challenging the LGBTQ plus community. Also, during the time period, other issues that were really causing controversy, obviously the abortion issue. There were people saying abortion is murder. They were talking about the right to life of the unborn baby. And a lot of the new right, it was fueled not only by politicians, but other things that were going on. There was a religious revival in the 1970s that was fueled by a televangelism movement where all these preachers were going on TV and spreading their message. And that was really popular, using TV to kind of spread religious messages. Homeschooling, there was a whole homeschooling movement, and an anti-equal rights amendment movement during this particular time period as well. And then you have the AIDS epidemic by the early 1980s, becoming a huge issue for the LGBTQ plus community, as well as a lot of other groups, in honesty, by this period as well. And this gives you a little chronology for AIDS. The virus emerges in the tropical regions of Central Africa first. It kills a young man in St. Louis by 1969, so I have a bit of a cold that I got, and it's not COVID, but I got it on Friday night from eating out and freezing cold outside, which I shouldn't have done, I'm really correct. A Norwegian sailor dies from AIDS by 1976, and it starts affecting North America and the US in the late 1970s. So the strain that affected the US comes from Zaire and Haiti, and it spreads in American cities among gay men first. It's more easily transmitted by anal rather than vaginal sex, and it affects hemophiliacs eventually and injection drug users as well. So it starts to spread throughout the US. And then you start to see the first official government reports and news reports on AIDS. So by June 5th, 1981, there's the first US government report on AIDS. You start to see the NBC Nightly News having a report by 1982. By 1983, the gay men's health crisis has been created by Larry Kramer, and he's on public TV saying this is a major issue, right, that we need to take seriously by the early 1980s. The first cases were believed to be a form of cancer. The lesions were called Kaposi's sarcoma. Eventually, early on, the disease in the early 80s was called GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. And almost all cases at that point in the early 80s seem to be among gay men. 2 years later, as it spreads more predominantly through the community, it's renamed AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. And one of the consequences of this is a revived safe sex movement in the US. People are challenging that culture of hooking up. And they're saying a lot of actually the gay bar culture they're kind of critiquing as fueling the spread of this disease in the US. So a few hundred cases in 1981 goes to 60,000 by 1988 in the US. So that's a pretty significant jump in a short amount of time, 7-year period. Doctors call it, quote, an immunological time bomb. They don't really understand. It's hard to predict how it's going to affect someone's body initially, and symptoms emerge in different ways. And some people die really rapidly, and others, are able to go on a longer period of time with it. It's not spread from one person to another like a cold or flu. And symptoms include lymph gland swelling, weight loss, fever, and fungal infection of the mouth and throat. And so this is a patient with AIDS, definitely not probably feeling good to have that rash. President Ronald Reagan responds to this finally. At first he ignores it. Conservatives are happy because it seems like undesirable populations are dying. Religious leaders are saying it's punishment for sin, it's punishment from God on the LGBTQ plus community. Reagan doesn't talk publicly about it until 1985, the year I was born, and by that time over 12,000 people have died. So that's how long it took for, well into the 80s for him to start to actually take political action. By 1987, AZT becomes the first drug approved to treat AIDS, and it helps to slow the progression, but it does not cure having the virus, and you have to take the pill pretty frequently to sort of get results. And it's a controversial drug. Linda Lubinstein becomes the first major doctor to take up AIDS patients. She was a paraplegic doctor, and she does a lot of the early research and study on AIDS. She calls for a closing of gay bars and hangouts like bathhouses because she thought it would help to lessen the amount of unsafe sex among gay men and the spread of the disease, which was a controversial decision, or a controversial outcry. As it, again, spreads throughout the general public, more people start to take it seriously, like the virus. And so one of the most notable AIDS cases that's outside the gay community is a case of Ryan White, who is a middle schooler from Kokomo, Indiana, who actually contracts AIDS, and his story is pretty widely publicized. At first, when he gets it, people are very cruel to him. He's like outcasted within his community, as is his family. He got it because he was a hemophiliac and he had a blood transfusion, and he eventually dies in 1990. And him and his mother, even when he was alive, worked really hard to get the government to pass legislation and to take this virus more seriously. Again, activists are going to respond to this. So the gay men's health crisis that we mentioned a couple times today is formed to connect gay men to services, sexually transmitted STI education, screening, diagnosis, and treatment. AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP, also formed to provide quicker testing and treatment of life-saving experimental drugs, to draw public attention to homophobic healthcare policies, to inspire disability rights activists through their campaign in the 90s, because their campaign was very theatrical. Much the credit to Larry Kramer, because being a playwright, he was very much into very public, almost theatrical demonstrations to get attention. And I'll show you for the campaign, and I'll show you a couple of pictures of that. And disability rights activists very much take up that similar style of protest by the 90s, doing things like the Capitol Crawl, to illustrate, to the politicians that a lot of buildings are not wheelchair accessible. So public demonstrations for ACT UP, very much, I think the picture is on maybe the next slide, very much theatrical demonstrations. ACT UP demonstrates in Wall Street in 1987. They adopt the slogan, "Silence equals death." They take over St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City in 1989. They drape, by 1991, a large common-looking creation over the institution of a homophobic senator. By 1995, AIDS is the greatest single killer of men from 25 to 44. So this actually shows you a couple pictures. They were very pioneering in a lot of their campaign techniques. So again, interrupting traffic with these posters laying like corpses in the streets, very much street theater, right? During this particular moment, you can see them holding fake tombstones. They had fake body bags that they would wrap themselves into and lay in a strategic position in front of a political building or public building. Here's another picture of the activists laying in the street, again, blocking traffic, making a scene, making news headlines as a result of their campaign, trying to get the politicians to take And so another way that activists responded is to create a community art project. And if you really think back historically, a lot of campaigns used very simple quotes were really important to even like the Black Freedom Movement. So this is a really cool project that the AIDS activists embark on. And they collect patches to memorialize the story of people who throughout the country had died as a result of the AIDS virus. And then they display the patches of the quote that people have sent in to honor their loved ones in strategic places like the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And this is ongoing, this project today. So you can actually go to the website and you can see digitally, they digitized a lot of the patches. You can scroll around on the quilt. It still travels. It was at Connecticut College this year, some of the patches, which was really, really cool. And so still very much something that's an ongoing project from this particular time period. So it's pretty interesting. And then these are some statistics on AIDS. Almost 700,000 people have died since the 1980s. These are from 2016, so they're actually a little dated, so it's probably higher at this point. Over 100,000 people have died in New York City alone. In 2016, the New York City AIDS Memorial was unveiled across from St. Vincent's Hospital. By 2017, the epidemic affected approximately 77 million people globally, killed 35 million, approximately 37 million people are living with HIV, or were living as of 2017 with the virus. I think recently, in light of COVID and some of these vaccines, there's been some more experimental innovations and treatment overall. And then the last thing that I have is more like for teachers, I guess, are some like documentaries and films that are really great about this topic. The first one is a link to, I think, the best AIDS documentary that I've ever seen. That's on YouTube, and if you just go to YouTube and you type in like AIDS documentaries, it's one of the first ones that comes up at the top. But it's a lot of the interviews are really wonderful because they're people that actually died or they worked in a hospital, and they're talking about like their experiences, and it's very diverse. So they have a diverse group and panel of like racially, in terms of age, that they're interviewing, gender, about people that actually had experienced or lived through this time period. They talk a lot about the sexual revolution. There's actually an ACT UP documentary that the other one is free on YouTube. This one is actually a paid one. And that one, is maybe not as, I think this one's better for students, but it also gives a lot of good information just specifically about ACT UP if you want to know more about the history. And then the two Hollywood movies, there's one if you want to learn more about the gay rights movement called Milk, that's on Harvey Milk, and it's the gay rights campaign in California that he led. And then there's the movie The Normal Heart, right, that's based on Larry Kramer's play that talks about some of the activism in like New York City and the sexual revolution. I thought it was a little explicit. I've shown parts of it to my women's studies class, and then I was like, maybe I should show that. But it is a moving movie, right? It's very touching, Hollywood movie on this topic. But that's actually sort of all I have for today, like with the PowerPoint. But I'm happy to take questions about this topic.
Very good. Next.
I'm curious to know, as a historian, what can you tell us about the degree to which information about the gay rights movement has been embedded in American public high school social studies curricula alongside of the struggle for Black equality and for workers' rights and for feminist rights as well?
Yeah, so they're currently I know CCSS has been working to overhaul the curriculum in Connecticut to be much more inclusive. And what's interesting is actually the state mandate on teaching LGBTQ history came out even before the more recent mandates on African American, Latinx, and Native American history. So this was also already something that educators and educational professionals right throughout Connecticut were kind of pushing to get included in the curriculum. They haven't mandated, like with the African American and Latinx studies, they mandated that there's actually a special course being included in the curriculum. And I think maybe Native American history starting in the fall. With this, it's more like it needs to be taught in the larger curriculum during the course of the semester. I think AAPI, right, Asian and Pacific Islander history, is another area that they want. The educators want to update their lessons and be more inclusive of. But this was very early on something the state of Connecticut said we have to incorporate into the curriculum more. And I'm not a social studies teacher, though my original degree is in social studies education, so I only know a little bit about it. But I would assume that especially in Fairfield County, that a lot of people are, based out of talking to colleagues, right, that are working in the public schools, are working toward making their curriculum more and more inclusive as time has gone on, like from my conversations with friends that are working in public schools. So this is definitely something that, is on the agenda and has been for a long time. So.
You summarized very nicely the different stages of the sexual revolution and the different elements that have occurred over a number of years. If you read the local newspaper or national press, the New York Times and others, about what's going on today across the country, there seems to be a movement in the opposite direction in a number of states. Can you comment about that?
Can you repeat it one more time? I think my
Sure.
brain is just having a cold.
It's okay. So much, I'll say it maybe a different way. There's been a liberalization of thought in the country from all of these topics, starting at, was it the 1920s, through 1970s, 1980s, and so on. A liberalization and understanding of folks' sexual orientation, and how they act and react to it. Of late, in this country, there seems to be a movement in a number of, I guess you could say, red states that is aiming towards the opposite direction. Can you comment about why that's happening?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say politically, exactly. I don't know a lot about politics in Florida. I've been reading the news headlines about what's going on. I listened to a podcast that was coming out of Columbia University. Actually, one of my professors, Adam Blatz from SUNY Binghamton, was on the panel, and he looks at education policy and a lot of the stuff that's been going on. And I think, if you look at historically shifts and trends that do go on over time, it tends to be that we do go through these cycles, right? Where there's these moments that are very liberal, like the 60s and 70s, and then there's sort of this backlash to it. And I think, if you look historically at this particular moment, in the 1970s, there was these conservative sort of underpinnings, and by the 80s and the 90s even was sort of a more conservative time overall. And I think we've moved, I think if you look politically at some of the news headlines, they were talking about the period that we were in, sort of like a second Gilded Age progressive era for a little while, and now we're seeing the pushback to some of that more, I think, liberal policy. What will happen in the future? I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard to tell. I think a lot of it depends on the election, and who gets elected and, to the next, as the next president. I think that's going to play a big part of it. It's hard to say how things will go in the future, but yeah, definitely there's been a lot of news headlines, especially about the stuff that's going on in Florida, and it's really not just Florida too. I mean, even in the higher ed realm, there's colleges and universities who are cutting gender studies, who are really pushing back against DEBI initiatives, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives, and so it's interesting to see how it shifts over time, and I'm sure there'll be a moment where it shifts back, but I think we're sort of in one of those transitional time periods, it seems like, politically right now, based on the stuff that's been going on overall.
Do you see it generally a movement in a positive direction? You gave us the Anita Bryant reaction, and people have moved past that, I think, considerable extent in some areas, not in others, certainly.
Yeah, it's very much depends on, I think, right now what part of the country that you're living in, what state you're in. It's because it's very dividing on a lot of these issues like birth control, abortion access. A lot of the different issues people are very, very much divided on. Even the recent gay rights legislation that President Biden signed last in the fall, right, was very controversial because it was a win in some ways because it says, oh yeah, the government's going to recognize the gay marriages that have taken place. But now, in certain areas, if there's anti-gay marriage legislation put in place, if you want to get married and you are not heterosexual, you have to travel to a location that is heterosexual to have the marriage. Your state is required to recognize it as a legal marriage when you return, but you can't get married in the state you're from. And I had to explain that to the students last semester when that legislation was passed and came out. So
I think it'd be interesting to see if the fact that a person is not getting married in a state where they're a resident is then held against them as disqualified
well,
to be able to go.
if they go home, it's they have
Yeah,
to.
I understand. Full faith and credit gets that right.
You have to travel, and it's the same thing with the stuff that's going on in the abortion access right now.
Very good point. Yes. Please.
I may not be correct on this, but my understanding was that at the time that the country was going through all this, blood was not being tested. So can I say that anything positive came out of this? I had a nephew that had hemophilia.
Mm-hmm.
How he managed to survive with transmissions, the blood transfer. I mean, has anything good come out of this? I mean, I know that people donated blood and
What's interesting about the whole blood donation issue is that I believe, and again, I'm not like super up on this, but I believe that it was actually during this time period that people actually started to ban gay men from donating blood because of the AIDS issue. But then if you look at the pandemic, they were so desperate in certain areas for blood donations that they started to open it up and get rid of some of those different laws against gay men donating blood and things like that. So that's really interesting recently how some of it has changed, I think, over time. So.
On one of the slides when we had a meeting with Brian, you were saying, like, there was anti-welfare, and I saw, although you didn't say it, anti-environmentalism. What was that?
Well, it's kind of like today, like, if you look
What was the movement that they were pushing against? I didn't
in the
know.
1960s and 70s, I'm trying to think of what some of the different things might be, but it was like very pro-big business. So anything that they were concerned about, environmental protections and how industry, and like in the 60s and 70s, air pollution was a big issue, emissions from cars,
Okay.
the pollutions of water and stream. I remember when I taught the 60s and 70s class last spring, like we did this a little bit with the students. I think Nixon administration passed a lot of the clean air laws in the U.S. In Europe, a lot of them were passed much earlier, which is interesting because we just did the Industrial Revolution with my class, and they're talking about air pollution from factories, which is a really interesting topic too, and how it affected human health. And like the average age in England around World War I for a man was like only like 5'6" because of all the air pollution was a factor, and like making them shorter because it was genetics, but it was also health and air pollution and stuff like that helped to decrease human height, which is really interesting. I think I'm trying to remember what the students looked up what the average age for men in the U.S. I think it's 5'9" currently. And what's really weird is that the average height for women is 5'4", and I don't have the old statistic for women off the top of my head. But I just thought that was interesting because I wouldn't have guessed it was 5'4". I would have guessed 5'6" or 5'5" for women currently. But the health improvements that we've had, right, the environmental improvements that we've had, have actually improved human health so much that the average heights are going up. So I thought that was kind of cool, like as a cool statistic.
When the EPA came out in the 1970s, right at the time of Anita Bryant, the quote you had from her.
Yeah, and Phyllis Schlafly, right? There were a lot of other activists too in the time period. I'm thinking of the women because I'm a women's historian, but I'm sure a lot of men that we're not mentioning as well. Very close water and that kind of thing.
Ross?
Yeah, so there was a lot of protest and a lot of activism to change the laws and to change the cultural mores. So we are now in a highly political period. What do you think in terms of what are the most effective forms of political action that people need to take now to take a more progressive view? Obviously I'm on the more progressive side rather than the other side. So how do we win the battle?
I think, well, just based on what I've seen right in the news, I think the direction that people are taking is much more right now at this moment is a lot of, at least if you start to think about like Black Lives Matter and some of the recent stuff that's gone on, is a lot of more very like much similar to what we're mentioning here, like very public demonstrations and protests. What is really interesting about specifically Black Lives Matter is when we were watching all these statues come down, a lot of people don't realize the larger context for that. When I teach French Revolution, during the French Revolution, all the way back during that time period, you see a lot of people protesting against the aristocracy, right, the Catholic Church, and they're pulling down the statues and they're defacing the statues in France, and it's part of this iconography that's part of this cultural war, that's part of the French Revolution. And there's in the literature, they're saying that this isn't a random mob doing vandalism, but it's very symbolic because the statues are showing or they're signifying, we don't even realize it a lot of times, who's controlling that public space, what ideology is dominant, and it's sort of sending this subliminal message as we walk around and see these things about what values that we're promoting. So I thought that was really interesting, actually learning about that in the context of the French Revolution and giving that longer legacy for some of this very public protest that even goes back to recent history, right, in the US. And I think people are more engaged in that kind of, those kind of public demonstrations, even globally. If you look at stuff that's going on in other countries like Georgia and different things that has made news headlines throughout the world, people are very much in a moment where it is very aggressive. Even if you look at like the Middle East and women protesting discrimination in Middle Eastern countries, we talked about that in women's studies, wearing the Middle Eastern headdress, right? That was all in the news in the fall. So it's really interesting to think about some of this stuff.
How do our kids in your class react to my generation and some of our generation here when they see this stuff from the 60s and 70s? They think we were a bunch of crazies or what?
No, I don't think, I think honestly, I think they'll learn about this stuff. They find it entertaining. I think they're shocked that their parents' generation actually, like, was this liberal and this, you know what I mean? Because I think they were surprised.
That's a good vibe.
But yeah, I have fun with these topics.
Yes, please go ahead. Sure.
I was thinking as you were showing, and the sexual revolution, and then thinking about that in terms of Me Too.
Yeah.
That sexual revolution was not so much women against men. It was like power. It was more like, well, we get to, have careers, and we get to, do the same. And so, thinking of the high-profile men who've been accused by the Me Too, Harvey Weinstein or Charlie Rose, or just so many. Those were men that women, we were kind of together with, and now, and that's why they say, oh well, now the standards have changed, but I was just operating out of what used to be okay. Do you know what I mean? And I'm just wondering how that, if you see the seeds of that happening in the 60s, so that women would eventually say, no, that wasn't okay. And there was a third revolution, sexual revolution almost.
That's interesting, and I think a lot of scholars probably would agree with you, and they would probably talk about, are we in third or fourth wave feminism at the moment too? They probably would debate that as well, but yeah, I definitely think that's an interesting argument. And that would be a cool op-ed, right? Like to say, like, has there been a third? Have we experienced over the last 5 years, like almost like a third sexual revolution? And then you could give examples from like Me Too, but also from some of the challenges to the abortion policies, to like internationally some of the other protests that are going on. I think you could be right, and like I said, I think that's worth exploring, potentially like a direction to go for an op-ed. I think it would be, because I think it would be interesting.
Well, do it.
But in your other conversation though, like too, that we were having before about the environmentalists, I was thinking as other people were talking, like too, like anti-nuclear weapons was a big thing. And that's, and I was also thinking about that, because that was still like an issue during this time period with the Cold War going on.
I can take you back just to the students again. I know you have those specific courses that are very self-selective, but you also have general orientation courses, right, that probably have a greater part of the student body. There's a recent case that come to light involving a North Carolina police officer who was transgender and has faced all kinds of opposition from local authorities to getting medical care. It turns out they're spending $1 million fighting her in the courts versus $10,000 worth of extra medical expense from this. How do your students react to information like that? Is it a split like what we see in our states, or is it more?
Well, I mean, one of the issues that's, it's not that particular case, but we talked about in women's studies in the fall, and because it's relevant to Connecticut, and it was actually in the news again today, I saw it, it was like researched, the issue was transgender athletes. And the students like that because they can relate to it because a lot of them play sports and that kind of thing. And I think, I don't know, I mean, I work in an institution where I think people are really into social justice. That's a really huge thing on campus. And so most of the students that I interact with, because I'm teaching classes like women, gender, and sexuality studies, tend to be more liberally minded and definitely open-minded about a lot of the issues and themes. So I don't get like aggressive sort of debate going on in a lot of the, on a lot of the topics. But I think if you were teaching in Florida or one of these other locations, there might be a lot of diverse, because we have a lot of students from New York City and New Jersey, both being more liberal states. But if you were in, again, one of these more conservative areas in the Midwest, so, the southern states, you might have a very different culture, right, when you start to bring up some of these topics, and the discussion might look very, very different in terms of people's political standpoints, definitely. I haven't gotten like too much pushback. I don't think I've ever gotten any like serious pushback. But again, we're in Connecticut, so it's like a different cut.
Thinking of the transgender athletes, you know the Glastonbury girls who soon becomes the track athletes and stuff. How do your students, because there's some pretty interesting positions on both sides.
Yes.
And if you're participating in the sports versus if you're watching and not, how do your students react to that? Because that's pretty current.
Yeah, no, it is really current, and the reason particularly it stuck out to me is because I'm from Cromwell, like originally, and some of the athletes I think that were involved in the original case were actually from Cromwell and they were in the track team. And like I said, I haven't witnessed in the classes that I've taught, like a lot of people having like outcry against having the transgender athletes, but I read, right, the perspectives on both sides, and some people feel that, it's not fair because these women who are biological women are at an unfair disadvantage due to the transgender athletes participating, and they feel very strongly about that, that they are getting not, like certain scholarships or certain rewards from the competition. And so there's a very, very strong opinion on the other side too. We haven't had a lot of, again, debate about it specifically in class among my students and their perspectives, but I've read the other perspective, on the other side too, and seen it in the newspaper.
Fascinating debate
Yeah.
in class.
Yeah. Yeah, I like I said, I think a lot of the people that sign up for intro women, gender, and sexuality studies do not lean politically in a certain direction. So.
Yeah, I think you make a very interesting point because I tend not to read anything about, transgender men. Like, it seems like that's fine. Biological women born biologically a woman becomes a man. It seems like no one's talking about having to advocate for that. It's like a separate, it's an issue that we don't really hear about. It seems to be more related to winning and scholarship and positioning. And I truly believe that, I think it's reasonable to talk about that, but then let's talk about what we need to talk about, and that's the issue. Because it's not about, is it really about safety, is it really about equity, what is it really about? And it seems to be about winning, and it seems to be about scholarship and positioning.
It's winning.
And that's okay that it's about winning, but then let's attend to the issue that that's what it's about, versus lumping the whole thing and saying we can't have it. In other words, look at the issue for what it is.
We had like a colloquium on campus because it was the 70th anniversary of Title IX in June, and I think it was 70th, right?
Yeah.
I'm not remembering that. And so 50th. My brain.
50. I was before time.
But like, so we had some people from athletics that came and talked about some of these issues, and it was interesting to hear that. Again, this is outside the realm because I'm not an athlete, and I wish I was actually. I wish I had that talent. But it was interesting to see like some of the coaches and stuff talking with the students about different issues about gender and sexuality, and definitely something that's still very much in the news today, and still something being debated for sure. Like definitely important, I think, issues that we're going to be continuing within higher ed, and also K to 12 conversations about in regard to athletics, sports, and things like transgender bathrooms, and even at Sacred Heart we had conversations about that because there was a dorm that didn't have some of those institutions in place. So it's interesting, and definitely something still very much relevant.
UConn had a recent Title IX case involving its women's crew team. settled on very attractive terms for the women's crew team. On the grounds that they were being cut out unfairly as compared to men's teams. Please, go ahead.
You indicated in 1969 that every state except Illinois had criminalized homosexual acts. What overturned that legally was why did I just draw a blank? The Texas case. If there's a constitutional lawyer,
Look over at Steve, he's pretty good at it.
Lawrence. Lawrence case, which was in the early aughts, I want to say 2003, so 30 odd years later. By any chance, do you have any idea how many states still had criminal laws on the books about homosexuality?
That I don't know, to be honest with you. There are a lot of bogus laws that are still in the books today. A lot of them aren't followed. One of them just not related to this at all, but there was a blue law, and I think it was a New England state that you can't walk around with an ice cream cone in your back pocket. So there's still a lot of bogus laws that are still in the books. It would be interesting to see. That would be a research project to look into to see what some of the laws are. A lot of them are enforced, but they're still there.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it on the fact they wouldn't be challenged. They could be overturned by the legislature, but if the legislature doesn't act, nobody challenges them, they're just gonna sit there, right?
Yeah.
So they never get tested in the courts.
Yeah, Steve, that's exactly my point. I think Lawrence moved the bar significantly, and then of course it led ultimately to Obergefell, which held that laws prohibiting gay marriage were illegal. I have to believe the influence of that over the past several years has been enormous, and probably, demonstrably so in terms of public opinion about gay people and gay marriage.
Yeah, I agree with you, definitely, for sure.
When you speak with your counterparts in Florida at the higher education level, do you find that they feel constrained in the way that elementary and secondary teachers are
Oh yeah,
constrained?
I mean, if you go on like social media, like Twitter, I have a pretty large Twitter community, and I see people posting, other historians and stuff posting stuff, and teachers all the time, feeling like, there was a really, I'm trying to think, it was the gentleman that wrote the book on the Lavender Scare, I think David K. Johnson might be his name, and he was just saying how he felt very much, like he wanted to leave Florida because of this legislation that was passed, and how he viewed it, how it would affect his teaching and his job. And so you could see it all over, and even with Twitter and social media platforms, people voicing their opinions on some of the new changes. So.
Are there other questions? It's been such a good presentation. And we really, really appreciate it. There's a reception, as you mentioned, Nick, earlier, here, and there will be a new series next year, so stay tuned. 17th series next year, 17th year.